It's strange how the internet can romanticize or completely trivialize ADHD. I started talking more about ADHD on social media, so negative comments started coming in. I kind of expected that because, it's social media. But what surprised me much more is that I actually understand some of that frustration quite well. Because the content about ADHD that we often come across on the internet, people with ADHD are portrayed as these chaotic types or as people who constantly need attention or basically a bit like adults who behave like hyperactive children. The problem isn't that we're talking about ADHD. The core issue and the resulting frustration are largely dependent on the way we choose to discuss it. How has the internet distorted the view of ADHD? The first thing that really fascinates me is that ADHD is often reduced to that quirky chaos. The internet often portrays us as those chaotic types whose behaviors are just entertainment for others. Maybe just that for a lot of people that chaos is mainly exhausting and often contains more of that quiet burnout. The second thing, have you noticed that quite often these videos are based on the idea that adults with ADHD are portrayed a bit like small children, hyperactive even though they're adults, unable to do anything on their own, always needing constant supervision. The problem is that if this is the only representation of ADHD you encounter, then people who experience it firsthand don't take the symptoms seriously, or they stop believing people with ADHD, or in general, they see us as immature. And that can be hurtful. And that's especially true for women, professionals, or anyone who, despite having ADHD, has achieved something big, something amazing, or even for those who have masked it their whole lives, which is often the case for women. Many adults with ADHD have spent years trying to appear competent, and then the internet turns their disorder into a meme about someone who can't sit still for 5 minutes. Problem number 3. Videos about ADHD are often entertaining, but the humor overshadows the real impact of ADHD. Those funny symptoms just spread a bit more easily, the algorithm loves this kind of thing, and the most severe manifestations and consequences of ADHD just aren't sexy. Because it's really about that chronic shame, the feeling that we're constantly failing. We have problems in relationships, we're financially impulsive or impulsive in other ways too. We often struggle with burnout. Many of us experience emotional dysregulation, so we end up angry at ourselves and get caught in that loop of chronic shame. And then we also have problems at work. And it's just not cute on TikTok, is it? The problem is that viewers only see the entertaining symptoms, but they don't understand why someone needs that support. Or those classic pieces of advice start to appear, like just try harder and push through, or just do it. But the thing is, that's just not how the ADHD brain works, but we'll talk about that some other time. Problem number 4. People with ADHD start to doubt themselves. When what you find about ADHD on the internet presents ADHD as some kind of characteristic, a quirky trait or an eccentric personality feature, building up that chaotic aesthetic, there's mess everywhere. Or things like, I forgot my keys again, so funny. So a lot of people just think, well, I probably can't have that. Sure, I'm a chaotic mess, but it's not funny like that. Or simply, I'm lazy. I can't handle adulthood. I'm just being dramatic. This can delay diagnosis or treatment, or people won't understand what their problem actually is. And now let's take a closer look at the well-known claim that nowadays everyone has a bit of ADHD, right? But not every kind of chaos is ADHD. These days, it's one of the most common comments under various videos because you know what? There's actually a bit of truth to it. Everyone forgets their keys sometimes. Everyone procrastinates on unpleasant tasks sometimes, or basically everyone has opened their phone to look something up and then 10 minutes later has no idea why they even picked it up in the first place. But diagnostic criteria aren't about some things happening to some people and not to others. Because if that were the case, pretty much everyone would have ADHD. It's more about the extent and frequency with which the symptom appears, and how much you're able to control it, and especially what kind of impact it has on your life. These can be, for example, functional impacts, because just like everyone occasionally forgets an appointment, but if you keep forgetting appointments repeatedly, it starts to threaten your job, your relationships, or your finances. Well, that's already a bit different. Occasionally, procrastinating is human. But sitting for 2 hours in front of a task that you know you want to do and still not being able to get yourself to start, that's a bit different. And being scatterbrained, we all have our better and worse days. But if you constantly feel like you're fighting your own brain, that's something else. The second thing is the chronic nature of it, and this is often overlooked. The difference is that ADHD isn't just about having a bad day or a bad week. It's something that follows you for many years and often since childhood. It just manifests a bit differently in different stages of life, and that's actually one of the reasons why many women only receive this diagnosis in adulthood. Not because they suddenly developed ADHD, but because they've actually been functioning their whole lives in spite of it. In spite of the diagnosis, in spite of this state of mind, this different brain wiring. And the third important thing is exhaustion. This is the part that the internet often doesn't show you because it's one of those things that's not sexy for the algorithm. When people hear ADHD, most of them imagine chaos. But I think a much more typical manifestation of ADHD is exhaustion, because you're constantly trying to catch up on things you've fallen behind on, because you're constantly monitoring your own brain. You're keeping an eye on it. You're thinking about things that others do automatically. And most importantly, a lot of people with ADHD don't look chaotic. On the contrary, they've learned to overcompensate and appear extremely organized. But the thing is, they invest a huge amount of energy even into organizing everyday things. And others don't see that at all. I don't want to take away anyone's life experience. And if you recognize yourself in those ADHD symptoms and those things make sense to you, that's absolutely fine. For many people, similar information and even these short, simplified videos were actually the first step toward understanding themselves. I would just be careful with that statement. These days, everyone is a little bit ADHD. Because some symptoms are simply human. But ADHD is not defined by that it appears from time to time. ADHD is defined by how often these things happen, how intense they are, and how high a price a person pays for them. Not every bit of chaos is ADHD, but when you have to put in twice as much effort your whole life, or maybe even more, for things that seem obvious to others, then it's not just about chaos anymore. It's a real impact. Okay, now let's go back a bit. And to that, what ADHD looks like in adults? Because in adults, it simply looks a bit different than it does in children. When you mention ADHD, most people imagine the stereotype of a little boy who rocks on his chair in class, interrupts others, and the teacher constantly has to reprimand him. But that boy grows out of it. But the ADHD doesn't go away. It changes. It takes on a different form. And a lot of adults with ADHD simply don't look hyperactive. They look more like they're constantly overwhelmed. You don't see an adult running around the room. You see someone who has 20 tabs open in their head at once. If only it were just 20. Someone who is trying with all their might not to forget that meeting, to reply to an email, to do the shopping, to finish a project, and at the same time, not to forget why they even came into the kitchen in the first place. Because hyperactivity often moves inside. It doesn't just move out of the body somewhere. It shifts into the head. And instead of running around the classroom, what comes next is an endless stream of thoughts jumping from topic to topic, constant mental overload because the brain never switches off. And quite often, we then experience this tendency to feel guilty for wanting to rest, for example. And this is where things start to get interesting. And the reason why so many women only get the diagnosis in adulthood, because many of them never fit into the stereotype of the hyperactive child. Because they were raised to be good little girls. And so they learn to mask. Masking means that a person develops strategies to hide their difficulties. So instead of forgetting important things, they create 10 different lists. Instead of missing deadlines, there's obsessive planning. Instead of being impulsive, there's constant self-control. And then there's perfectionism. Many people consider it the opposite of ADHD, but in fact, it can be a consequence of it. When people talk about ADHD, they often imagine chaos and disorder. However, some people with ADHD, especially women, are perfectionists. Not because they have everything under control, but because they're afraid of what will happen if they lose that control. Perfectionism is not a sign that everything is working as it should. It's more like an emergency mechanism that holds things together. So why are diagnoses increasing nowadays? You've probably heard the phrase, back in our day, there was no ADHD. Well, there was. It's just that people didn't know as much about it as they do today. Today, we understand better what ADHD looks like in adults. What it looks like in women, what it looks like in people who aren't physically hyperactive. And I think that's exactly why so many people are only diagnosed in adulthood, It's not that they somehow developed it over the years, but rather because for the first time, someone showed them that ADHD doesn't necessarily look like the stereotypical fidgety disruptive student. And this brings us to one thing about ADHD that isn't talked about all that often. Yet it can explain why, in recent years, we've been hearing about so many women who are only diagnosed long after their 30s, around 40, or even in their 50s. It's not that they suddenly developed ADHD, as if they caught it from their children. Due to decreasing hormone levels and constant fatigue and overload, they reach a state they can no longer effectively compensate for. I've talked here about masking, about lists, about perfectionism, about functional chaos that from the outside looks like a successful, organized life. But these strategies require an enormous amount of energy. And then, the period of perimenopause comes when a woman's body starts to go through hormonal changes. And suddenly, certain things just stop working. Tasks we've managed for many years suddenly become much more difficult. Organization becomes more demanding, concentration gets worse, and overwhelm comes much more quickly. One of the reasons is that female hormones also affect systems in the brain that are connected to the regulation of attention and dopamine. And when, during perimenopause, these hormone levels start to change significantly, ADHD symptoms also begin to worsen. And for many women, this means a very unusual period and unique experiences, because throughout their lives, they often felt that even if it took all their strength, they were able to manage the situation. It wasn't easy, they were extremely exhausted, but they managed it. And suddenly they can't anymore, not because they suddenly became lazier or because they suddenly stopped trying, but some strategies that worked for 20 or 30 years simply stopped being enough. And I think this is exactly where some of the misunderstandings around late diagnoses arise. Some people look at the increase in diagnosed women and say, that must be some kind of trend. But a much more likely explanation is that today we finally know what ADHD looks like outside the stereotype of the hyperactive schoolboy. That's actually also the reason why comments like everyone has ADHD these days bother me, because behind these late diagnoses, it's often not someone just looking for a label. Most of the time, it's someone who has spent a large part of their life masking and is trying to understand why even ordinary things cost them such an enormous amount of energy. And for many people, it's the first explanation that finally starts to make sense to them. When I started talking about ADHD more publicly, I expected questions. I also expected disagreement. And honestly, I completely understand some of those reactions. I understand why it can be frustrating to watch the internet turn ADHD into just some funny personality trait. I get why you're tired of videos where every forgotten thing is automatically a sign of ADHD. But the thing is, there's quite a big difference between a caricature and reality. And yes, sometimes the internet turns ADHD into a meme, just some 30-second entertainment. But that doesn't mean that people who actually live with ADHD don't exist. It doesn't mean that there aren't people who have been struggling for years with organization, exhaustion, or the feeling that they have to put in twice as much effort for things that seem obvious to everyone else. It doesn't mean that there aren't women who only receive a diagnosis around the age of 40 and suddenly understand something that never made sense to them their whole lives. And it doesn't mean that the problems disappear just because people have started talking about them more. I don't see the problem as everyone having ADHD these days. But for the first time, we're hearing about people who were overlooked for many years. People who either got labeled or came to believe themselves that they were different, disorganized, irresponsible, or too sensitive. And today, they finally have the language to describe their own experience. If you're interested in topics like this, and if you want to talk about ADHD without fear-mongering, sensationalism, or pretending that there are simple solutions, I'd appreciate a like and a subscription. And if you want to dive even deeper down the rabbit hole of exploring the ins and outs of ADHD, for my Czech followers, there is the Glitches and Glory community on Skool. If you're looking for an English-speaking Skool community, I'll provide links to two of my favorite communities in the description below. They offer great insights into ADHD, neurodivergence, and personal productivity. Thanks for watching all the way to the end, and remember, not every glitch is ADHD. And sometimes it's worth looking into the reason why. Why does a certain mistake keep repeating over and over again?